No, Ronyon. Here we are for part 2 of the Grammar of Koi portion of our Tsevhu tutorial series. Before we get started, let's do a short recap of the last video. Using the Koi itself, all tenses and 3 basic moods are encoded. For tenses, you have present, the 3 past and 3 future, and the non-finite. For moods, there is declarative, interrogative, and imperative. Additionally, for small koi, there are 3 subclause types that take the place of the 3 moods of a large koi. Those are noun clauses, adverbial clauses, and relative clauses. In addition to the grammar encoded on a koi, grammar is shown by where ripples, or the actual words of a sentence, sit in relation to the fish. I call this relational grammar ripple slots. Let's talk about ripple slots actually. In essence, there are 3 different types of slots: verb slots, noun slots, and modifier slots. Verb slots occur within the context of the tail, meaning in and around the tail position. The koi tail is the driving force of forward momentum and direction, so it makes sense that it is an indicator of action. There are several different encoded positions based on some basic possible aspects for the verb of the sentence. In my last video, I mentioned that the base form of a verb is an ongoing action. As the base, it makes sense for it to sit here, right on the base of the tail. Thus, the verb would sit here in the sentence he is running, because that's what he's doing, and has been doing, and likely will continue to do. This ongoing action is a verb aspect called continuous or progressive aspect in linguistics. You can tell what the continuous is in English by the format of a to be verb followed by the verb root and the ing suffix. Within the continuous aspect, aside from the basic form, we also have 2 other slots. The first is located on the port side of the tail and is often used for future reference within a tense, often as a sort of plan for the future. The English formula for this is will or going to plus the verb root. And, in this case, since we are still within the continuous frame, we'll also add the ing ending. This generates sentences like, he was going to be running next, he will be running soon, or he's going to be running. This is called the prospective aspect, specifically the prospective continuous aspect. Opposite of this in space and meaning is a slot on the starboard side, which is past reference within a tense, often referring to an action with some sort of relevance to the action of the main tense it's in. It has current relevance, in other words. English marks it by the auxiliary verb have, adding the main verb root, and remembering continuous, adding ing again. Well, to be totally accurate, you also need a to be verb in between to help bridge have and the verb root. This produces sentences like he had been running, he will have been running, and he has been running. This aspect is known as retrospective, more commonly known as perfect aspect in linguistics. Notice that the auxiliary verb, also known as a helper verb, is the one that carries that aspect in English. It's also what tells you the actual tense of the sentence. Not all languages do it this way, but for English, you can think of auxiliary verbs as the modes of transportation for tam, or tense, aspect, and mood if you remember from the last video. I want to talk a little bit more about these 2 aspects, retrospective and prospective, and what they actually do in practice. They can be a bit hard to understand, but they're also really interesting once you figure it out. Let's look at what retrospective and prospective mean as words. The roots retro and pro mean back and forward, but they also often refer to the past and the future. Spective comes from the Proto-Indo-European root spec, meaning to observe, the "iv" ending making it an adjective. In other words, retrospective and prospective are about looking back to the past and forward to the future. Let's draw a timeline to better visualize this. Here is the main tense of the event, or when the event actually happens. Let's say it's happening right now. At this moment, I usually talk about things that are happening now, but I can also talk about things that are going to happen in the future before they actually do. I'm not in the future, but I can still talk about it. This is prospective. Additionally, I can talk about things that happened in the past. I'm not in the past, I'm in the present, but I can talk about things that happened in the past after it already happened. This is retrospective. I bet you're thinking, okay, I kind of understand. But how's that different than having the main tense be in the future or the past? You're right, it's not all that different. It's the difference between saying she slept versus she has slept. It's a slight nuance difference, with has slept usually used for something like emphasis or additional information in response to another sentence. This is what I mean by current relevance. It references a past event with relevance to the current situation. In fact, many languages don't actually allow aspects like retrospective to work within the present tense because it is such a nuanced distinction. But the thing is, I really like nuance, so we're keeping it in Tsevhu. So yeah, not much difference. That is, if the frame of reference the tense is in is the present. If you switch the main tense to another tense, that story changes. In fact, within the context of storytelling, retrospective and prospective are extremely useful. This is because, while daily life predominantly uses present tense, stories often use past tense as the main tense of the whole work. If that's the case, then have you ever thought about how a setting in past tense talks about other tenses? It doesn't change tense, does it? You don't suddenly go into present or future tense to talk about a future event. And if something happened in the past of the past, how do you get more past? It all starts feeling a bit time travel-y or paradoxy with multiple time frames, doesn't it? So, how do you talk about the past's past or the past's future? I hope you've guessed it by now. We're talking retrospective and prospective aspect. Going back to our timeline, if the main tense is past, then we use prospective to talk about the future in the past, and retrospective to talk about the past in the past. Interesting to note that this won't actually tell you when the present tense is in comparison to the past or to the event that the prospective aspect indicates. It could be really anywhere within this range, which means that the prospective event could still be within the past, at the present, or in the future. Similarly, future tense has future in the future and past in the future. And again, the present tense could be within the concrete past, present, or future. In other words, these two aspects help us form relative tenses to the main tense we're setting the statement in, so it really does help with explaining time travel. Sorry about that really long tangent, but these are the sort of things that make me think, gosh, language is cool. I'm really hoping that explanation made any sort of sense. Anyway, back to ripple slots. In addition to the base slot, we have its opposite, an action viewed as a complete thing. This is called the perfective aspect and is often referred to as a bounded action with clear endpoints. I've always had this as a feature of Tsevhu, but having it as a ripple position on the koi is a new thing. I used to have it only as a prefix for the verb to be written out as a part of the ripple, but I've been wanting for a while to encode it positionally instead. Luckily, we do have a place for it, and it actually makes a lot of sense as an action that is complete and left behind here in the wake. Like continuous, Perfective also has 3 slots. The first is the base slot, which produces sentences like he ran, he will run, or he runs. Notice that English has perfective as the base or simplest form of the verb, the dictionary form, in other words. And to get continuous, you need to add the to be verb and the ing ending. In that sense, Tsevhu is the opposite of English, because the simplest form of the verb is the continuous, and you need to alter that to get the perfective. To understand perfective, though, we need to know what a bounded action is. In linguistics, boundedness refers to an action that has a clearly defined beginning or end and is viewed as a singular event. It often crosses over with a term called telicity, but we'll cover that in a later video more about the specific lexical meanings that verbs can take. Past and future perfective are fairly straightforward in meaning since it's easy to define the endpoints, but present perfective gets a little fuzzy, especially with English, because it's hard to make an action bounded when you're in the middle of doing it. You can do it, like in the sentence, there he runs, but with just he runs, it often takes a habitual meaning, as in he runs every Tuesday, or what's called nomic aspect, which is what's used for generally recognized truths such as birds fly. Tsevhu doesn't use present perfective for either of those, though. It's purely for a bounded action within the present tense, since habitual is done with an auxiliary word, and nomic is done using the non-finite tense. Eventually, it might take on some meaning that's more culturally specific, but we'll just have to wait and see. Let me know if you have any ideas in the comments. Also, as a side note, because I think it's important to point out, Earlier when we were talking about retrospective, we also said it's more commonly referred to as perfect aspect. Perfect aspect, however, is not the same thing as perfective aspect, which is why I've been calling it retrospective, especially because of the contrast it has with prospective. Terminology confusion like this isn't uncommon in linguistics because linguistics as a discipline is one with a couple hundred years under its belt. It has history, and on top of that, if a language has a feature, it's no guarantee that it'll use the feature in the exact same way another language will, creating a fuzzy application of the name overarchingly. You can, and linguists have, created more nuanced terms to mark the differences, but at some point the amount of terms to describe features becomes so bloated that they begin to lose meaning. The Tsevhu Discord server has referred to confusing linguistic jargon as dumb linguistics, or dumplings. That aside, now we can finally move past the base form and the perfective aspect. This should be a bit easier now, because it's just a mirror and the opposite of continuous. You have retrospective perfective, like he had run, and prospective perfective, like he was going to run. Take a second to look at how English structures this, with tense using to be, going marking prospective, and a plain verb form for perfective. One thing to note also, with both the continuous ripple set and the prospective ripple set, their slots are relative to the tail, so that means if you have a command or a question, the ripples will move with the tail. I really wanted to get through all the slots in this video, but I feel like what with all my tangents, it's getting dense in information and starting to get a bit long too. So I think we'll have to call it for this video just as explaining the verb slots, and hopefully that wasn't too confusing to understand. A lot of the time when I learn, I really just have to try putting it into practice for it to click. I hope you take some time playing around with these ripple slots so it will for you too. Well, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. So then, away at the van.